Throughout human history, wars have erupted for land, for kings, for gods, for survival itself. But what if I told you that some of the deadliest battles mankind has ever fought began over the most ridiculous things imaginable? A wooden bucket, a wandering pig, a flock of birds, even a jar with a severed ear floating inside. Tonight, you'll discover wars so absurd, you'll question whether humanity ever possessed logic at all. And if you're brave enough to walk through these chapters of madness, make sure you hit that subscribe button now, because this is just the beginning. Picture a medieval battlefield, not the grand conquests of kings or crusaders, but thousands of armored men charging into death for an object worth less than a loaf of bread. Imagine priests blessing banners, lords sharpening swords, and peasants dragged into war, all because someone said they stole our bucket. Absurd. Yes, but it happened, and it happened on a scale large enough to leave 2,000 corpses rotting in the mud. Our journey begins in Italy, the year 1325. Forget the Renaissance glory, you know this was a land fractured into city-states, each consumed by rivalry. Bologna and Modena were neighbors whose hatred was as old as their stone walls. They fought over borders, over honor, over alliances. But one night, a group of Modenese soldiers crept into Bologna not to steal gold, not to sabotage defenses, but to take a wooden bucket from the city's central well. A bucket plain and ordinary, yet it would unleash a storm of blood. The people of Bologna woke to horror. To them, this wasn't petty theft. It was humiliation, a dagger in the heart of their pride. The bucket had served generations, lowered by rope into cold water, lifted by countless hands. To lose it to their rivals was an insult unbearable. Messengers were sent demanding its return. Modena laughed. Their answer, "Come and take it." And Bologna swore they would, even if it meant marching tens of thousands of men into battle. Thus began what history calls the War of the Bucket. Bologna gathered an army of 30,000 supported by the powerful Guelph faction, while Modena assembled 7,000 with the rival Ghibellines. The clash wasn't a scuffle, it was a full-scale medieval war. Priests promised divine favor, blacksmiths worked day and night forging blades, and farmers abandoned their fields to fight for honor. The prize was not land, not crowns, but a single bucket that today would cost less than a bottle of wine. The armies met at Zappolino. Imagine it. Autumn leaves crushed under hooves, the earth trembling as armored knights charged with lances leveled. Trumpets blared, banners snapped, and men roared oaths of vengeance for a wooden pail. When the melee began, swords clanged, arrows darkened the sky, and the cries of the dying rose like a funeral hymn. Over 2,000 men fell that day, their lives paid for wood and iron hoops bound together in the shape of a bucket. When the dust cleared, Modena stood victorious. They not only refused to return the bucket, but paraded it as a trophy. In an act of pure mockery, they hung it in their cathedral tower, a relic not of holiness, but of humiliation. 7 centuries later, it still hangs there silent, yet screaming of the day pride mattered more than human lives. And tourists? Yes, tourists pay to see it, gazing upon the object that made neighbors slaughter each other. The story should have ended there, buried in medieval absurdity. But history has a cruel sense of humor. Centuries later, on the far side of the world, another petty squabble would erupt, not over a bucket this time, but over a pig. A pig that loved potatoes. A pig whose appetite nearly ignited a war between two of the most powerful empires on Earth. It was 1859 on San Juan Island, a misty strip of land between what we now call Washington State and British Columbia. Its soil was rich, its air crisp with the scent of salt and pine. But the island had a problem. It was claimed by both Britain and America. Farmers on each side tilled the land, uneasy neighbors under rival flags. And then came the black boar that would decide their fate. Charles Griffin, an Irishman working for the Hudson's Bay Company, owned the pig. Enormous, stubborn, with a hide that glistened in the morning sun, the animal had no respect for fences. Every day it waddled to the potato patch of an American farmer, Lyman Cutler, and feasted as if it were at a banquet. Cutler begged Griffin to control the beast. Griffin sneered, "Deal with it." But on June 15, 1859, when Cutler found the pig once again rooting in his potatoes, something in him snapped. He shouldered his rifle, aimed, and fired. One bullet, one pig, and one world teetering on the edge of war. The shot echoed across San Juan Island like a thunderclap. The pig collapsed in the dirt, its squeal cut short, and silence followed. Cutler believed the ordeal was finished, his potatoes safe, his farm secure. But he underestimated the weight of pride and property. Griffin, the pig's owner, was furious. He demanded $100 in compensation, a small fortune in 1859 equivalent to thousands today. Cutler offered 10. The insult stung like salt in a wound, and soon words of arrest and retaliation were on every lip. Fearing British justice, Cutler ran to American authorities for protection. His cry was answered not by a handful of men, but by an entire company of U.S. soldiers. They marched onto San Juan Island, rifles, gleaming drums beating as if preparing for war itself. Across the sea, the British saw the American flags rising and responded in kind. 3 warships appeared on the horizon, their black silhouettes menacing against the pale morning mist. What had begun with a pig now stood on the brink of an international war. The Americans brought 461 soldiers and 14 cannons to the island. The British countered with 167 guns mounted on their ships capable of reducing the farmland to ash. For weeks the two sides stared at each other, muskets, loaded cannons primed, waiting for the tiniest spark. One nervous finger could have unleashed chaos across the Pacific Northwest. The soldiers themselves understood the absurdity. Men joked in whispers, wondering how history would remember them if they died for a potato-eating pig. Nights were restless, filled with the creak of wooden ships and the low hum of campfires where men laughed nervously to mask their fear. Even the officers knew that their standoff teetered on the edge of madness. Yet no one wanted to blink first, for blinking meant weakness, and weakness meant defeat. Incredibly, the war that never was ended without a single human casualty. Diplomats intervened, tempers cooled, and by autumn the cannons were silenced, the ships withdrawn. The only life lost in the so-called pig war was the pig itself, buried in the very soil it had once ravaged. Still, the dispute dragged on for 12 more years of negotiations before arbitration finally declared San Juan Island American soil. And all of it began with one farmer, one pig, and one rifle shot. But the absurd theater of war did not stop there. Decades later, in a land far from European politics or American farms, an entire modern army would march not against men, not against nations, but against birds. Yes, birds. The mighty Australian army would face the emu, a creature 6 feet tall, covered in feathers, armed with nothing but legs like pistons. The soldiers thought it would be a slaughter. They were right, but not in the way they expected. It was 1932 in the desolate fields of Western Australia. The Great Depression gripped the world, and the government urged farmers to plant more wheat. But as the fields flourished, so too did an uninvited enemy. Emus in their thousands descended like a feathery tide. They trampled crops, devoured grain, and spread destruction across the plains. Desperate farmers pleaded for help, their voices echoing through Parliament. The answer: send in the army. Major G.P.W. Meredith was assigned the task. He arrived with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan was simple: mow down the birds and end the invasion. But the emus were no ordinary prey. When the first shots cracked through the sky, the birds scattered into small darting groups. They ran faster than horses, zigzagging through the fields, vanishing into dust clouds before the guns could cut them down. Day after day, the soldiers tried and failed. Bullets whizzed through empty air, machine guns jammed in the dust. And the emus, agile and relentless, seemed to mock their pursuers. Farmers watched in disbelief as the greatest military force in the land was humbled by creatures with brains no bigger than a walnut. By the end of 6 days, fewer than 1,000 birds lay dead. Over 19,000 remained striding proudly across the wheat fields. Major Meredith filed his report with grim honesty. He confessed that the birds had superior mobility, better tactics, and even a sense of guerrilla warfare. Newspapers roared with laughter. Around the world, headlines declared Australia loses war against birds. The emus became folk heroes celebrated as feathered rebels who defied the machine gun. And to this day, no nation has ever dared declare war on animals again. As humiliating as it was to lose against birds, history had even darker absurdities in store. Sometimes the spark wasn't livestock or buckets, it was human cruelty preserved in glass. In the early 18th century, one British sea captain would carry with him a reminder so grotesque that it would plunge empires into war. His name was Robert Jenkins, and in his pocket was his own severed ear. The year was 1731. Jenkins was sailing through the warm Caribbean waters when a Spanish Coast Guard vessel intercepted his ship. Spain controlled vast swaths of the region and resented British merchants who nibbled at their trade. The Spanish captain, Juan de Leon Fandino, meant to send a message. His men tied Jenkins to the mast, mocking his helplessness as the waves slapped against the hull. With a flourish, Fandino drew his cutlass. In a single motion, he sliced off Jenkins's left ear. The pain was blinding, blood soaking his shirt, his cries lost to the wind. Then came the cruelest gesture of all. The Spaniard handed Jenkins the bloody ear and sneered, "Take it to your king. Tell him I would do the same to him." It was not just mutilation. It was humiliation branded into flesh. Most men would have collapsed in despair, thrown the ear away, and tried to forget. But Jenkins was not most men. He preserved the ear, storing it in a jar of spirits, carrying it with him like a cursed relic. Days turned into months, months into years. 7 years, in fact, during which Jenkins lived with the constant reminder of what had been stolen from him. That ear was no longer just flesh, it was vengeance waiting to be unleashed. By 1738, Britain and Spain were already at each other's throats over trade disputes. Tension hung like storm clouds over Parliament. And that was when Jenkins saw his chance. He walked into the chamber, placed his jar upon the table, and unveiled the ghastly contents before the shocked politicians. Gasps filled the hall. Some recoiled in horror, others erupted in fury. Here was proof-rotting, stinking proof of Spanish barbarity. The effect was immediate. Outrage spread like wildfire. Pamphlets circulated, speeches thundered, and the public demanded justice. Soon, Parliament roared with a single voice: Spain must pay. Not for trade routes, not for policy, but for the ear of Robert Jenkins. Thus began one of the most farcical wars in European history, the War of Jenkins's Ear. The conflict was anything but small. For 9 long years, Britain and Spain clashed across continents. Naval battles raged in the Caribbean, blood stained the shores of Georgia, and cannons thundered in the Philippines. Thousands of sailors and soldiers perished, all because one captain refused to let go of his severed ear. What began as personal vengeance had become an international bloodbath, and yet the irony was staggering. Jenkins never became a great hero, nor did his war achieve lasting change. Instead, it merged seamlessly into the larger War of Austrian Succession, as though Europe couldn't resist bundling madness into greater madness. Jenkins faded into obscurity, but his ear had already written its place in history as perhaps the most bizarre casus belli of all time. But if you thought an ear was strange enough to launch a war, wait until you hear about oranges. Yes, oranges, bright, fragrant, harmless fruit. At the dawn of the 19th century, Napoleon's grip on Europe was tightening, and his allies would bend or break under his will. Yet even here, personal vanity, lust, and citrus would become the centerpiece of a war. It was 1801. Napoleon demanded that Portugal, Britain's oldest ally, cut off trade with London. But Portugal's economy depended on British goods. To obey Napoleon would mean ruin. To refuse would mean invasion. Spain, under French influence, marched at his command. Their leader was Manuel de Godoy, a man more interested in impressing Queen Maria Luisa, his mistress, than in strategy. And as his troops advanced, he plucked oranges from the conquered groves, sending them back as love tokens while families fled burning homes. The campaign was swift and brutal. Portuguese towns fell with little resistance, their streets echoing with the tramp of foreign boots. Families abandoned hearth and home, clutching children as smoke curled from rooftops. Yet Godoy seemed less concerned with suffering than with his romantic gestures. Crates of oranges carefully selected were dispatched to Madrid, each fruit a grotesque bouquet for the queen. Imagine it while soldiers torched villages and peasants wept, the Spanish commander composed love letters with citrus. Every orange was proof of conquest, every delivery a whisper to his royal lover, "See how I burn nations for your affection." The symbolism was obscene, and yet it became the defining memory of the entire conflict. Within 2 weeks, Portugal capitulated. Its ports were forced shut to British ships, its people subdued under foreign rule. But the so-called War of the Oranges left no lasting victory. Portugal would soon reopen trade with Britain, Napoleon's economic blockade would collapse, and Godoy's reputation would be forever stained as the general who waged war for fruit. Think of it: a bucket, a pig, a flock of birds, a severed ear, and oranges. These were not the causes of history's most important wars, but they became symbols of how fragile pride and power can be. Entire nations were dragged into chaos, not for survival, not for freedom, but because leaders refused to swallow humiliation. And this is the chilling truth. Wars do not always ignite from grand ideals. More often than we care to admit, they begin with something small, petty, almost laughable. Yet once blood is spilled, there is no turning back. A joke becomes a tragedy, a prank becomes a massacre, a single stubborn refusal becomes a decade of slaughter. The War of the Bucket reminds us that pride can outweigh reason. Bologna could not tolerate insult. Modena could not resist mockery, and so 2,000 men perished for an object we would today find in a garden shed. It stands as a testament to the deadly power of humiliation when stoked by rivalry. The Pig War shows how fragile peace can be when nations stand eye to eye with weapons drawn. One animal, one farmer, one gunshot, and suddenly 2 empires nearly tore each other apart. The absurdity was clear even to the soldiers, and yet duty demanded they stand ready to kill for potatoes. The Great Emu War reminds us that nature itself will not bow to human arrogance. The Australian army, armed with modern weapons, believed they could bend the wilderness to their will. Instead, they became the butt of global ridicule. Machine guns failed, but the birds endured, proving that some enemies cannot be conquered with bullets. The War of Jenkins's Ear demonstrates the terrifying endurance of personal vengeance. One man's mutilation, bottled and preserved, became the spark for an international war. The ear rotted, but the anger festered, spreading until thousands lay dead on distant shores. And the War of the Oranges, it shows how vanity, lust, and politics can intertwine to create tragedy. Godoy thought of romance, Napoleon thought of domination, and the people of Portugal paid the price. Their suffering was reduced to citrus fruit, a grotesque love letter written in blood and pulp. Across Europe, these conflicts were often remembered not for strategy, but for their absurdity. Songs were sung mocking the lost soldiers, pamphlets circulated detailing the most ridiculous blunders. And yet behind every jest lay sorrow. Families mourned sons who had died defending a bucket, a pig, or an ear, while historians scratched their heads at how such minor sparks could ignite such fury. Consider the soldiers themselves. Many were conscripts dragged from fields or workshops given weapons they barely understood. They marched to battle with hearts full of fear and stomachs empty of food, only to fight over objects so trivial that centuries later we struggle to believe the wars were real. Yet they were, and the scars remain in the towns and villages, invisible but unhealed. The irony is pervasive. Leaders consumed by pride or personal vendettas often ignored common sense. Bologna's magistrates and Modena councillors debated endlessly over etiquette, while their citizens bled in the streets. Godoy, intoxicated by desire and ambition, overlooked the suffering of Portugal. Humanity, in all its wisdom, had chosen folly once again. Sometimes history's lessons come disguised as comedy. The Great Emu War is one such lesson. Modern weaponry failed, logistics faltered, and bureaucrats bungled orders. Newspapers across the world laughed, yet the Australian farmers understood the stakes. Their livelihoods, their crops, their survival were on the line. Humiliation may be funny, but hunger is deadly serious. Wars like these reveal a duality, the world as seen by rulers, and the world as lived by the common people. Leaders see strategy, honor, prestige. They imagine themselves immortal in history books. The masses see fear, chaos, and death, and sometimes the trivial cause that the elite elevate into war is met with disbelief and horror by those forced to endure it. Imagine the journey of a Portuguese villager during the War of the Oranges. Smoke rises from distant towns, soldiers march through the streets, and yet in Madrid, Godoy prepares bouquets of citrus for his queen. Life and death, love and destruction exist side by side in a grotesque choreography orchestrated by those far removed from the consequences. In Bologna, 2 centuries earlier, citizens would awaken to the clamor of drums and the distant cries of the dying, all because of a painted bucket. Mothers wept for sons sent to fight over a simple container, a bucket that had once been the subject of a jest, now the catalyst of tragedy. The absurd had become deadly. Wars often begin in whispers and rumors. A pig seen wandering in the wrong field, a mistaken insult at a noble banquet, a preserved ear presented to a monarch, all trivialities that escalate into chaos. Each incident reminds us how fragile order is, how quickly civility can unravel, and how small sparks can ignite infernos. Even nature can participate in humanity's folly. The emus of Australia moved across the land with no intent but survival, yet their persistence became a challenge to human pride. Armed men fired with precision, yet each failed shot amplified their frustration. The land itself seemed to mock the invaders, a silent, unyielding witness to human folly. History, when stripped to its essence, is often a record of absurdity wrapped in tragedy. Buckets, pigs, ears, emus, and oranges, objects so mundane yet capable of shaping lives, nations, and reputations. And as we examine these events centuries later, the mixture of disbelief, amusement, and horror reminds us that human nature has changed little, and yet the consequences remain painfully real. The War of the Emus was not just a battle, it was a reflection of misplaced priorities. Soldiers trained for human enemies found themselves outmatched by creatures guided only by instinct. Each failed ambush, each misfired shot humiliated those who believed that discipline and firepower could conquer nature itself. And yet the emus endured their silent victory, echoing across the plains. In the streets of Portugal, the aftermath of the War of the Oranges left confusion and resentment. Villagers returned to destroyed orchards. Soldiers carried bruised pride, and Godoy basked in perceived glory. The chasm between ruler and ruled grew wider, the absurdity of the cause juxtaposed with the gravity of the suffering left behind. Across time, history has a way of repeating its lessons. The Battle of the Bucket. The Great Emu War and countless other conflicts illustrate a pattern trivial, triggers ignite serious consequences. Pride, miscommunication, and stubbornness ensure that humans, regardless of century, remain at the mercy of their own folly. Soldiers, scholars, and citizens alike are caught in these narratives. The common people bear the brunt, yet their stories are often lost, buried under pomp propaganda and the laughter of distant observers. Only in rare chronicles, diaries, or local legends do we glimpse the human cost hidden behind the comedy of errors. The human mind struggles to reconcile absurdity and tragedy. How can a bucket or an emu cause death? How can oranges dictate the fates of kingdoms? And yet the evidence is clear. Records, ruins, and memories testify to these events. It is a sobering reminder that the object itself is irrelevant. It is the human obsession with honor, pride, and control that transforms trivialities into catastrophes. Every war has its heroes and its fools. Sometimes the line between the two blurs. An emu simply seeking food becomes an unintentional adversary. A noble chasing prestige becomes a villain in the eyes of those who suffer. History does not forgive ignorance or arrogance, and yet it often celebrates the very individuals whose decisions caused suffering. In Bologna, centuries later, scholars debated the significance of the bucket war. Some focused on strategy, others on social dynamics. Yet all were struck by one truth: the world's deadliest conflicts often spring from the most innocent beginnings. A bucket, an ear, a minor insult. These were enough to unleash chaos upon those who had no say in the matter. The Emu War taught lessons of humility and hubris. Modern weaponry organization and training could not overcome adaptability and instinct. Humans so proud of intelligence and tools were humbled by creatures acting on simple survival. Victory, once assumed as a birthright, became an elusive prize in the hands of nature. In every absurd war, we find echoes of human error magnified. Leaders mistake bravado for strategy. Emissaries misinterpret signals, and the populace suffers. The history books, though dry in their presentation, hide narratives of laughter and tears, mockery and mourning, and moments where the line between heroism and foolishness is almost impossible to discern. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: in the theater of human history, the props, be they buckets, pigs, or emus, are never innocent. They reflect the obsessions, insecurities, and ambitions of those who wield power. And as long as humanity continues to value pride over prudence, the absurd will always walk hand in hand with tragedy, waiting for the next unsuspecting stage. History often paints wars with grand strokes of strategy, alliances, and victories, yet in the shadows the absurd thrives. A single mistake, a trivial dispute, or a comical misunderstanding can ripple into consequences far greater than anyone imagined. The Emu War and the Bucket War remind us that history is not always serious. Sometimes it is darkly humorous, even while lives are at stake. Traveling back to Portugal, the echoes of the War of the Oranges lingered in both countryside and capital. Oranges, once symbols of abundance, now marked the memory of miscalculation. The fruit's journey from grove to battlefield became a metaphor for human folly. Seemingly harmless beginnings can end in chaos and suffering, especially when pride dictates action. Soldiers returned home, emus roamed free, and kingdoms adjusted borders in response to conflicts born of triviality. Time, that relentless archivist, recorded these events with both precision and irony. Chronicles captured death strategies and outcomes, yet they also immortalized the ridiculous, leaving future generations to marvel at the absurdity that once dictated real lives. Even the deadliest conflicts carry moments of absurdity, moments where the seriousness of war collides with the triviality of its cause. To study history is to walk this tightrope, understanding the human cost while acknowledging the laughter and incredulity it evokes. Perhaps the greatest teachers are not victories or treaties, but the ridiculous instructing us to temper pride with humility. From emus in the Australian outback to a stolen bucket in Bologna, the world is littered with examples where human obsession with honor and control meets the unyielding reality of consequence. These events, absurd as they seem, illuminate universal truths. Intelligence alone does not guarantee success, and instinct, chance, or sheer luck can overturn the most meticulous plans. Observers of history may chuckle at the idea of an emu war or a battle over a bucket, but the laughter is tinged with unease, because behind each absurdity lies a human story. Soldiers misled civilians, displaced lives, interrupted or ended, all victims of decisions made for pride, fear, or misunderstanding. Humor does not erase tragedy, it accentuates it. Across continents and centuries, absurd conflicts have shaped societies. Laws were rewritten, boundaries redrawn, reputations tarnished, and lives altered forever. Even when the world laughed, those involved often did not. This duality of comedy and calamity intertwined is a signature of history itself and a lesson for those who think that triviality cannot wield power. Modern scholars often debate the seriousness of such conflicts, yet the lessons remain relevant. Leadership requires discernment. Pride must be balanced with prudence, and the seemingly trivial must never be underestimated. The absurd serves as both warning and reminder. History's stage is unpredictable, and even the smallest actors can change the script in profound ways. Reflecting on these events, one realizes that absurdity is not merely comedic, it is cautionary. A stolen bucket, a marauding emu, or a minor territorial dispute can catalyze suffering, humiliation, and societal change. These incidents remind us that human history is fragile, shaped by both grand strategy and small missteps, and that survival often depends as much on adaptability as on strength. And so, as we close this chapter of the absurd and the deadly, we are left with a paradox to study. History is to witness human folly, yet also to learn from it. Pride, miscommunication, and underestimating the world around us will always be catalysts for chaos. By remembering these stories, the Emu War, the Bucket War, and countless others, we equip ourselves with perspective, humility, and the wisdom to avoid repeating the mistakes of those who came before.